They said the screams rolled across the plains like thunder. Summer 1462. The Ottoman Empire, fresh from conquering Constantinople and shattering dynasties, marched toward a small principality called Wallachia, expecting a swift campaign. Days, perhaps weeks. Instead, the advance stalled when an odor drifted across the countryside. Death, decay, and something indescribably foul. The front ranks slowed, scouts froze in their tracks, and when the Ottoman forces crested the final hill before the capital, they saw it. A forest, except the trees weren't trees, they were people. 20,000 bodies raised on sharpened stakes, arranged in geometric precision across the valley. Soldiers who had marched under the same banners now hung suspended in the air, swaying in the wind. Many had rotted in the sun for weeks, skin blackened and swollen. Others still clung to life, writhing, choking, unable to scream anymore. The sight was so overwhelming that the Sultan himself, the conqueror of the Byzantine world, took one look, turned his horse around, and ordered a retreat. This wasn't a battlefield. It was psychological warfare executed on an industrial scale. But the real horror was this: it wasn't the act of a madman. It was deliberate strategy, engineered to fracture the minds of the most powerful military machine on Earth. The popular stories about Vlad the Impaler barely scratch the surface. Not because they exaggerate, but because they leave out the parts that were even worse. This is the unfiltered account of how Vlad III transformed terror into a weapon that reshaped empires. And by the end of this, the most disturbing truth becomes clear. The brutality aimed at bodies was only half the plan. The real target was the human mind. To understand how a ruler reaches the point of designing a valley of impaled corpses, the story must rewind to a question almost no one asks: what breaks a person so fully that they begin to model their leadership on trauma? The year was 1442. Vlad was 11. His father, Vlad II, Dracul, known as the Dragon, made a political gamble with the most formidable power in the region, Sultan Murad II of the Ottoman Empire. The terms were simple. Dracul kept his throne in Wallachia. In return, he surrendered his two youngest sons as hostages, not symbolic gestures, living insurance. Vlad and his younger brother, Radu, were removed from their homeland and delivered deep into Ottoman territory. They weren't thrown into dungeons. They were placed inside imperial palaces at Edirne and later Anatolia, dressed in fine silks, educated by scholars, fed well, trained by elite soldiers. On the surface, it looked like privilege, but the reality, it was controlled indoctrination. Every lesson, every punishment, every act of discipline served one purpose: shaping hostages into assets. While official histories often gloss over this period as education, the environment functioned more like a laboratory of imperial psychology. This was where Vlad spent the most vulnerable years of his life, ages 11 through 17, observing the empire that would one day become his enemy. He watched public executions crafted not merely to kill, but to terrorize entire cities. He studied how the Ottomans enforced obedience through fear, spectacle, and precision. He learned that mass intimidation didn't just weaken enemies, it controlled populations more efficiently than any standing army. But there was something deeper. He also learned what it meant to be powerless. His brother, Radu, adapted to life in the palace and formed a close bond with the Sultan's son, Mehmed. Vlad, however, refused to submit. Ottoman records describe him as difficult, resistant, frequently punished for defiance. Some accounts hint at beatings, perhaps worse details lost to time, but consistent with hostage conditioning. What is certain is that these years forged something unbreakable and dangerous within him. Modern psychologists might call it a deep-rooted persecution mindset, combined with an overwhelming need for control. But Vlad didn't crumble. He catalogued everything, every punishment, every technique, every calculated method of fear. Piece by piece, he was constructing an internal arsenal. In 1448, after 6 years in captivity, Vlad was released and returned to Wallachia. He was 17. 2 months later, chaos erupted. His father was murdered by rival boyar families, noble factions notorious for switching allegiances between Ottomans and Hungarians whenever it benefited them. His older brother, Mircea, was brutally killed, reportedly buried alive. Vlad returned home only to be surrounded by treachery and political sharks. There was no one left to trust, and this is where the story shifts. Revenge wasn't his only goal. Vlad wanted to reshape Wallachia using the tactics that had once imprisoned him. Everything the Ottomans had demonstrated: psychological warfare, theatrical violence, strategic terror. He planned to refine into something they had never encountered from a European ruler. But he couldn't move immediately. For the next 6 years, he lived in exile, studying war strategy, political maneuvering, and the weaknesses of both Ottoman and Hungarian power structures. Then, in 1456, backed by Hungary, Vlad seized the Wallachian throne, and the persona history remembers as the Impaler began to emerge. His coronation feast should have been a moment of unity. Instead, it became a declaration of how his rule would operate. Vlad invited the boyar families, many of whom had participated in his father's downfall and his brother's murder. Dozens arrived in their finest garments, confident they were attending a celebration and prepared to pledge their allegiance. The great hall shimmered with decorations. Wine flowed, music played. The nobility relaxed, unaware they were already trapped. Midway through the feast, Vlad stood and asked a question that sounded disarmingly casual. "How many princes of Wallachia have you lived under?" The older nobles, proud of their longevity, shared their answers. 10, some said. Others claimed a dozen rulers. What they didn't realize was that they were boasting about their skill at outliving leaders, often by betraying them. Vlad smiled. Then his soldiers moved in. Every boyar who had answered was seized on the spot. But Vlad didn't kill them immediately. The calculated mind behind the later impalement fields was already at work. He divided the nobles into groups based on age and physical strength. What followed would set the template for his reign. One built on eliminating threats, dismantling treacherous elites, and ensuring that no rival could ever undermine him again. The older nobles, the men who had engineered the destruction of Vlad's family, were dealt with first. They were taken outside the palace walls and impaled immediately, not quickly and not mercifully. The stakes were prepared with the same cold precision that defined every part of Vlad's rule, sharpened, rounded, and positioned to avoid vital organs. Death came slowly, sometimes over hours, sometimes across entire days. Their screams filled the air as Vlad turned his attention to the next phase of his plan. The younger and healthier boyars, along with their families, were marched north toward the ruins of Poenari Castle. Stripped of noble garments and forced across 50 miles of harsh terrain, they reached the crumbling fortress, only to discover that their choice was no choice at all. Either rebuild the fortress with nothing but their hands, or be killed. For months they dragged stones up the mountainside, worked in the cold until their skin split, and laboured under the watch of soldiers who offered no sympathy and no rest. The noble finery they once wore rotted off their bodies. Blood replaced silk, sweat replaced gold. Many died from exhaustion long before the castle took shape. The few who survived were transformed forever, broken, physically, mentally, and socially. Vlad's purge wasn't only vengeance, it was a complete restructuring of Wallachia's political order. The boyar class that had manipulated rulers for generations was demolished. In its place, Vlad installed a new elite people whose survival depended entirely on him. Fear wasn't simply a byproduct of his methods, it was the glue binding his new government together. But this was still internal. The boyars were Wallachian. The world beyond his borders was about to learn what Vlad's rule truly meant. In 1459, Sultan Mehmed II, the same Mehmed who had known Vlad as a child in the Ottoman palace, sent envoys demanding the annual tribute established under Vlad's father. On top of the money, the Sultan demanded something far more insulting. Vlad was to appear in Constantinople and renew his oath of vassalage in person. Ottoman ambassadors expected negotiation, or perhaps defiance. What they received became one of the most notorious diplomatic incidents in medieval history. When the envoys entered the court and refused to remove their turbans, observing a genuine Ottoman religious custom, Vlad asked them to explain the practice. They did so, likely believing the conversation was a sign of respect or curiosity. Vlad praised their devotion, then he issued an order that turned the room into a nightmare. His soldiers seized the ambassadors and nailed the turbans to their skulls. He did not kill them. He ensured they lived. Their mutilation was symbolic, an attack on custom, identity, and dignity, but also intentionally survivable. They were sent back to Constantinople as walking warnings, their agony on full display. By the time they reached Mehmed, they were half mad with pain, permanently disfigured, and unable to articulate anything but horror. Mehmed understood the message instantly. Whatever bonds had existed between the two former hostages were gone. What stood in Wallachia now was a leader who had taken the Ottoman playbook on terror and evolved it into something the empire itself had never fully embraced. Conflict was unavoidable. But before the Ottoman army could march, Vlad continued broadcasting his intentions to anyone who dared challenge him. One of the most misunderstood aspects of his reputation, impalement, was not simple brutality. It was technique, engineering, and psychological calculation. The common image of a victim skewered straight through the torso is largely inaccurate. A direct strike through the chest would kill within minutes. That defeated the purpose. Vlad's method was deliberately designed to prolong suffering. Medical analyses and Ottoman-era descriptions outline the process. The victim was positioned face down. A stake, rounded, smooth, and thoroughly oiled, was inserted through the rectum, angled to avoid major blood vessels and critical organs. Then the victim was hoisted upright. Gravity completed the process. Their own weight pushed the stake deeper through the body at an excruciatingly slow pace. If organs were avoided successfully, the victim could remain alive for 1 to 3 days. In some accounts, the stake eventually emerged near the shoulder or chest. The goal was never immediate death. It was spectacle. Modern experts in psychological warfare note that witnessing prolonged suffering destabilizes the mind far more than witnessing quick death. Vlad understood this intuitively. A beheading horrifies a crowd for seconds. Impalement terrorized entire regions for days. But the act itself was only half the strategy. Staging was everything. Vlad placed impalements where visibility was unavoidable. Public squares, roadways, near wells, at crossroads, outside city gates, along major trade routes. He leveraged geography the same way generals leverage artillery ranges. The more people who saw the victims, the more witnesses he created. And witnesses became storytellers. Fear spread faster than soldiers ever could. He even built hierarchies into his displays. Nobles were impaled higher, peasants lower. The highest stakes were often reserved for military leaders or captured commanders. The visual message was unmistakable. Every person, even in death, occupied a defined place in the world he controlled. Reports circulated of elaborate configurations, circles, spirals, star-like patterns. Whether every detail is factual or embellished through propaganda, they align with Vlad's documented mindset. These arrangements were not random cruelty. They signaled order, precision, authority. They implied he had so much control that he could choreograph agony. A German pamphlet from 1462, part propaganda, part eyewitness testimony from Saxon merchants, claimed Vlad sometimes dined among the impaled. According to these accounts, he had a table placed in the center of the killing field, eating calmly while surrounded by dying men, seemingly unbothered by the suffering around him. Even if exaggerated, the story endured because it matched the one truth. No historian disputes. Vlad used terror the way others used diplomacy, taxation, or law. It was infrastructure. It was policy. It was the foundation of his rule. And he wasn't finished. His conflict with Mehmed II was about to erupt into a confrontation that would define his legacy and horrify Europe for generations. Whether the specific dining among the impaled incident happened exactly as the pamphlets claimed will probably always be debated. But the purpose behind the story isn't up for debate. The message was unmistakable. Vlad was telling the world he operated far beyond the normal boundaries of human behavior. Horror no longer affected him. Fear didn't touch him. He controlled it. The Saxons, who had their own political friction with Vlad, helped spread this image across Europe. They produced pamphlets filled with crude but unforgettable woodcut illustrations. These were among the earliest mass-distributed horror narratives on the continent. The artwork was primitive, but its impact was enormous. The stories travelled quickly, embedding Vlad's reputation into the European imagination like a brand seared into wood. But across all this shock and propaganda, one essential question lingered beneath the surface. Was any of this actually effective? Were these methods practical military strategy, or simply the actions of someone indulging in cruelty because no one could stop him? The answer emerged in the summer of 1462, and it would show that Vlad's approach wasn't just effective, it was devastating on a scale the Ottomans had not anticipated. By early 1462, Sultan Mehmed II had reached his limit. Vlad didn't just refuse tribute, he escalated. He launched raids deep into Ottoman territory south of the Danube. In one particularly notorious operation, Vlad led a small force across the river and, according to a letter he personally sent to the Hungarian king, killed more than 23,000 people. He even kept a tally, listing victims by gender and age category. Mehmed II was not a man accustomed to being challenged. This was the ruler who had taken Constantinople at 21, crushed rebellion after rebellion, and presided over the mightiest military complex of its time. For someone like him, dealing with a defiant Wallachian prince was supposed to be routine. Instead, it was becoming an embarrassment. So the Sultan decided to end the problem himself. In spring 1462, he assembled an enormous army. Estimates range from 60,000 to 90,000 soldiers. The exact figure is unclear, but even the lowest estimates indicate a force more than 3 times larger than the entire military-aged male population of Wallachia. This wasn't a punitive campaign. It was designed to erase Vlad and everything connected to him. Vlad commanded perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 fighters. Many were farmers with limited training. A traditional field battle would have ended in total annihilation, so he refused to fight one. When the Ottoman army crossed into Wallachia, they found nothing of value. Villages had been abandoned, wells poisoned, crops burned, livestock hidden, homes stripped of anything useful. Vlad had ordered a scorched earth retreat into forests and mountains long before the Ottomans reached the border. Their supply lines lengthened mile after mile. Soldiers began to grow hungry, dehydrated, and restless. These weren't random ambushes. Vlad had spent years training specialized strike groups for guerrilla warfare. Units of 50 to 100 men slipped into Ottoman camps under darkness, assassinating sentries, stealing into tents, setting fires, slaughtering supply animals, and then melting back into the night before alarms could spread. Ammunition wagons were destroyed. Horses, stampeding in panic, trampled soldiers in their beds. The goal wasn't to wipe out the army, it was to break its nerves. Sleep deprivation, hunger, paranoia. A sense that the woods themselves were alive with unseen enemies. But Vlad's most daring operation came on the night of June 17th, 1462, a moment later remembered simply as the night attack. Captured Ottoman soldiers revealed the Sultan's camp position near Targovinte, guarded by the elite Janissary Corps. This was the chance Vlad had waited for his entire life. He personally led roughly 10,000 men into the darkness, wearing captured Ottoman uniforms and speaking enough Turkish to sow confusion. The plan was direct: infiltrate the camp, reach the Sultan's tent, and kill Mehmed II before anyone understood what was happening. Chroniclers describe chaos erupting almost instantly. Tents ignited, horses bolted in terror. Ottoman soldiers awoke to what sounded like their own comrades attacking them. The Wallachian strike force surged toward the area where the Sultan's pavilion stood. Some accounts suggest Vlad and Mehmed may have momentarily seen each other through the smoke and fire before the Janissaries formed an unbreakable protective ring around the Sultan. After hours of brutal close-quarters combat, Vlad realized the inner circle couldn't be penetrated. He ordered a retreat, and his fighters disappeared back into the dark as quickly as they had appeared. Ottoman casualties were debated. Some sources claim around 2,000 dead, while Ottoman historians often list far fewer. But numbers weren't the point. Psychologically, the damage was overwhelming. Mehmed II, at the center of the largest army in Europe, had nearly been assassinated by a force a fraction of his size. His commanders were shaken. His soldiers hadn't slept properly in weeks. Their morale collapsed under the constant awareness that an enemy they couldn't see, hear, or predict had almost killed the most powerful man on the continent. They continued marching toward the Wallachian capital. But with each step, suspicion replaced confidence. The countryside seemed dead. Every burned village looked like a trap. Every shifting shadow looked like Vlad's men preparing for another strike. And then they arrived at Targovite. Nothing written can truly replicate what they found on the approach to the capital. But historians have tried. The first wave of soldiers caught the stench long before they saw the source. Anyone who has ever encountered a dead animal in the heat of summer might imagine the smell. Now multiply that by thousands, and then add the sickening sweetness of decomposing human flesh that hangs in the air like a physical barrier. Then the stakes came into view, first a few, then dozens, then hundreds. And soon it became clear that the field did not end. Contemporary accounts describe a forest of the dead, stretching nearly 2 miles long and more than half a mile wide. The precise number remains debated. Ottoman reports, likely downplayed, claim roughly 10,000 bodies. Wallachian and Hungarian accounts list 20,000. Modern estimates settle between 15 and 20,000 impaled corpses. But the number was not the only horror. It was the arrangement. This was not chaos. It was architecture. The stakes were placed in deliberate, geometric layouts. Concentric circles, carefully aligned rows, and sprawling patterns that formed star-like shapes when viewed from elevated ground. It was organized, calculated, a message carved into the landscape with human bodies. The Ottoman soldiers who approached that site weren't just witnessing death. They were walking into the most advanced psychological weapon in medieval Europe. Vlad had prepared this nightmare landscape long before the Ottomans arrived. Weeks, possibly months, were spent capturing soldiers, deserters, and pro-Ottoman locals from earlier border clashes. He kept many alive solely to build this display. By the time Mehmed's army approached, some bodies had been decaying for weeks under the summer sun. Others had been impaled more recently, and a few, according to multiple chroniclers, were still alive on the stakes. The Byzantine historian Leonikos Chalkokondyles, who interviewed eyewitnesses, wrote that the groans of the dying carried across the entire plain. Some victims had hung there for days, their bodies slowly failing, but their consciousness still intact. They were too weak to yell, too injured to move, but still aware of their suffering. Even hardened Ottoman soldiers, men who had taken cities, survived siege warfare, and witnessed their own share of brutality, began vomiting. Reports describe troops refusing orders, stumbling away from the site in shock. Others deserted entirely, willing to face execution rather than march deeper into a valley of the dead. At the center of the entire scene stood the tallest stake of all. Mounted on it was Hamza Pasha, a high-ranking Ottoman commander captured in an earlier engagement. Vlad had left his military garments intact, or what was left of them, and positioned the corpse directly along the route Mehmed would travel. It was a message delivered without words. If this is what I do to your generals, imagine what waits for you. Sultan Mehmed II, victor of Constantinople, commander of countless campaigns, stopped his horse. Accounts differ on the exact reaction, but the most accepted version comes again from Chalkokondyles. It is impossible to take the country of a man who performs such deeds. One who can wield power in this way is formidable indeed. This wasn't admiration, it was recognition. Mehmed realized he wasn't facing a normal rival. He was confronting a strategist who had taken Ottoman-style fear tactics and pushed them far beyond anything the empire had ever attempted. And by that point, the Ottoman campaign was already unraveling. The supply lines were overextended. Vlad's scorched earth policy had deprived the army of food. The night raids had demolished morale. Commanders were whispering that retreat was the only rational option. but the Forest of the Impaled was the breaking point. It wasn't a military defeat, it was psychological collapse. Within days, Mehmed ordered a withdrawal. He left a detachment under Vlad's brother, Radu, now an Ottoman-backed rival, to continue pressuring Wallachia, but the Sultan himself led the main force back toward Constantinople. The most powerful military superpower of the era had marched into a small principality with overwhelming numbers and superior resources, and turned back because fear had achieved what conventional warfare could not. Vlad had won, but victory carried a cost, and the next chapter revealed something tragic. Terror may win battles, but it eventually consumes the one who wields it. One might expect Christian Europe to celebrate Vlad as a hero after he repelled the Ottoman Empire. In some ways, he was praised. The Hungarian king acknowledged his success. The Pope reportedly commended his defense of Christendom, but they misunderstood something crucial. Vlad couldn't simply switch off the methods that had saved his nation. By late 1462, he was impaling Wallachian merchants for overcharging customers. He was impaling nobles for rumoured disloyalty. Entire villages faced impalement for minor offences. The tactics forged to confront an existential threat became his default response to every problem, large or small. His internal support crumbled quickly. Radu, backed by Ottoman funds and soldiers, positioned himself as the rational alternative to Vlad's escalating brutality. Hungarians distanced themselves as Vlad's behaviour became increasingly unpredictable. The very same terror that had saved Wallachia was now isolating its ruler. In November 1462, just months after forcing the Sultan to retreat, Vlad fled into Hungarian territory. And here is one of the harshest ironies in medieval history. His supposed ally, King Matthias Corvinus, imprisoned him. The charges remain debated. Some say Matthias forged letters to make it appear. Vlad was negotiating secretly with the Ottomans, giving the king an excuse to detain him. Others argue Vlad was simply too dangerous, too unstable, and Hungary preferred to sideline him quietly. He spent 12 years in captivity, not chains and torture like his Ottoman youth, but house arrest under relatively comfortable conditions. During this time, he married a Hungarian noblewoman and had children. Accounts describe him as obedient, disciplined, and even adapted to court life. In 1476, opportunity returned. Wallachia had fallen into chaos under weak rulers. With the help of Stephen the Great of Moldavia and Hungarian military backing, Vlad regained the throne in November 1476. He held power for perhaps 2 months. In either December 1476 or January 1477, Vlad was killed in battle against an Ottoman force near Bucharest. Details remain murky. Some chronicles claim he died when his own troops, unfamiliar with his new armour, mistook him for an enemy. Others maintain he was surrounded and overwhelmed by Ottoman soldiers. What is known is the aftermath. His head was severed, preserved in honey, and sent to Mehmed II in Constantinople. It was displayed as proof that the Wallachian threat was extinguished. After a lifetime of psychological warfare, terror, and rebellion, Vlad ended as a trophy in the capital of the empire he had fought from childhood to death. His body was reportedly buried at Snagov Monastery on a small island. Excavations in the 1930s revealed a tomb empty. His final resting place remains unknown. So, what do we make of this legacy? In Romania, Vlad III remains a national symbol, ferocious, uncompromising, and credited with preserving Wallachian autonomy during one of the most dangerous periods in its history. Statues stand in his honour. His likeness appears on souvenirs. He's remembered less as a monster and more as a harsh but necessary defender. The rest of the world sees something different. After Bram Stoker borrowed his name for the 1897 novel Dracula, Vlad became synonymous with vampirism, bloodlust, and supernatural cruelty. Ironically, this fantasy version hides the more disturbing truth. Because the real horror is simple, everything Vlad did was human. He wasn't an inhuman beast. He was the product of a system that rewarded brutality, taught that power required spectacle, and shaped his worldview through trauma. He took those lessons and pushed them to their absolute limit. The Forest of the Impaled was strategy, not madness. The night attacks were military calculus, not chaos. Every public execution, every grotesque display was a deliberate psychological operation. And the most unsettling part, it worked. Against staggering odds, terror accomplished what armies couldn't. The question isn't whether Vlad was evil, that answer is obvious. The real question is what his success says about human nature and how easily fear can bend the world when wielded with precision. History's darkest chapters aren't just stories of what happened, they're warnings about why it worked. If you want to keep uncovering the brutal truths that textbooks prefer to avoid, subscribe. Because the most important lessons aren't in the victories, they're hidden in the shadows we're afraid to examine.